In the early autumn of 1932, a series of dust-covered Ford Model A's began navigating the unpaved backroads of Macon County, Alabama. To the sharecroppers working the cotton fields, these vehicles represented something rare and almost entirely unheard of: the arrival of the federal government. At the time, the Great Depression had tightened its grip on the American South, and for the impoverished black residents of this rural enclave, survival was a daily calculation of calories and endurance. Medical care was a luxury that few could afford, and fewer still had ever experienced. So, when representatives from the United States Public Health Service arrived with a promise of free health care, the news spread through the churches and general stores like a sudden change in the weather. They were looking for men specifically, men who suffered from bad blood. In the vernacular of the time and place, bad blood was a catch-all term. It could mean anything from anemia and fatigue to the more shadowed, unspoken ailments that plagued the community. 600 men eventually stepped forward. They were fathers, brothers, and sons, mostly illiterate, all living at the edge of the economic collapse. They were told they were being enrolled in a special program, a high-level medical observation that would last for 6 months. They were promised free meals on exam days, free transportation to the clinic at the Tuskegee Institute, and the guarantee that their burial expenses would be covered, a point of immense dignity for men who had spent their lives with nothing. What the records suggest today, however, is that the 600 men were entering a narrative they had no hand in writing. Of the group, 399 were already infected with syphilis, while 201 served as a control group. From the very beginning, the parameters of the study were defined by what was not said. The men were never told the name of their condition. They were never told that the treatments they were receiving, vials of colorful tonics and small white pills, were, in many cases, little more than aspirin or mineral supplements. At the time, the medical community viewed syphilis as one of the great mysteries of the human body. In its late stages, it could attack the heart, the brain, and the nervous system, leading to blindness, paralysis, or insanity. There was a prevailing theory among some researchers that the disease manifested differently in different races, a hypothesis rooted more in the social hierarchies of the 1930s than in biological data. To test this theory, the Public Health Service believed they needed a natural history of the disease, a record of how it progressed from infection to death without the interference of medicine. The men in Macon County believed they were being cured. In reality, they were being watched. But as the initial 6-month period drew to a close, a quiet shift occurred within the administration of the program. The funding that had initially supported the study began to dry up, and the original goal of providing a short-term observation followed by treatment was discarded. Instead of concluding the program and offering the best medicine available at the time, the directors made a decision that would alter the lives of everyone involved. They decided to continue, and that's when the nature of the program began to shift into something far more clinical and far more concerning. By 1933, the study had transitioned from a short-term observation into a long-term project. The researchers realized that the real value of the study, at least from their perspective, was not in the life of the patient, but in the eventual autopsy. To ensure the men remained in the program, a complex system of incentives and psychological management was established. Central to this was a nurse named Eunice Rivers. Nurse Rivers was a local, a woman who lived in the community and spoke the language of the men she served. She was the bridge between the white doctors in their starched lab coats and the skeptical farmers who had long learned to distrust authority. To the 600 men, she was a figure of mercy. She drove them to the clinic in her own car, she checked on their families, and she ensured they received their free meals. Historians have long debated the role of Eunice Rivers. Was she a victim of the era's rigid hierarchies, or a willing participant in a grand deception? Some believe she truly thought she was helping these men get the only form of attention they would ever receive in a segregated South. Others point to the records which suggest she was instrumental in tracking the men down when they tried to leave the study, ensuring that the material, as the subjects were sometimes referred to in internal memos, did not disappear. The examinations became more frequent and more invasive. One of the most significant moments in the early years of the study involved the introduction of the spinal tap. To the men, this was described as a special free treatment, a final, powerful cure for their bad blood. In truth, it was a diagnostic procedure meant to see if the syphilis had migrated to the neurosystem. The procedure was painful and carried significant risks, yet the men lined up for it, lured by a letter sent by the Public Health Service. The letter was written on official stationery, designed to look urgent and prestigious. It warned the men that this was their last chance for a special treatment. It was a calculated move, leveraging the men's fear and their desire for health to perform a procedure that offered them no therapeutic benefit. As the 1930s turned into the 1940s, the world around Macon County began to change. The United States was drawn into World War II, and with the war came a massive mobilization of the American workforce. Many of the men in the study were called to the draft. This presented a problem for the researchers. If these men were inducted into the Army, they would be tested for syphilis and given the standard treatment of the time, usually a grueling regimen of arsenic and mercury. To prevent this from happening, the Public Health Service took a step that remains one of the most chilling chapters of the archive. They provided local draft boards with a list of the men in the study and requested that they be exempted from treatment. The men were told they were unfit for service, but they were not told why. They were sent back to their farms, back to the study, and back to the slow progression of a disease they didn't know they had. It was during this era that a medical miracle occurred. Penicillin was discovered, and by the mid-1940s, it had become the gold standard for treating syphilis. It was safe, it was effective, and it was becoming widely available. This was the moment the study should have ended. The natural history of the disease was no longer a mystery. There was a cure. However, the researchers viewed the advent of penicillin not as a solution, but as a threat to their data. If the men were treated with penicillin, the decades of observation would be spoiled. The records suggest that a conscious decision was made to withhold the life-saving drug from the participants. But as the years stretched into decades, the silence surrounding Macon County began to develop its first cracks. Internally, within the Public Health Service, not everyone was comfortable with the direction the study had taken. There were memos, hidden in the depths of government filing cabinets, that questioned the ethics of what was happening in Alabama. Yet, for a long time, those voices remained quiet. The men grew older, their hair turned gray, their bodies began to fail, and many of them passed away, their burial insurance finally being put to use. The study, now entering its third decade, was no longer just a medical observation. It had become a self-sustaining bureaucratic machine. What the researchers didn't realize was that the world was catching up to them. The civil rights movement was beginning to stir, and the moral landscape of the country was shifting. The secret of the 600 men was becoming harder to keep, and the justifications for the study were beginning to sound increasingly hollow. But what happened next changed the narrative entirely. By the 1950s, the program had achieved a strange kind of longevity that defied the usual cycles of government research. It had survived the Great Depression, a world war, and the transition of several presidential administrations. But the strangest part of this era wasn't what was happening in the rural clinics of Alabama. It was what was happening in the prestigious medical journals of Washington and New York. While the 600 men remained in the dark about their condition, the medical community at large was being kept well informed. Between the late 1930s and the 1960s, more than a dozen scientific papers were published in peer-reviewed journals detailing the progress of the study. These reports meticulously documented the physical decline of the participants, charting the damage to their hearts and nervous systems with clinical detachment. There was no attempt to hide the fact that these men were being observed without treatment. The data was presented at conferences and discussed in classrooms. To many physicians of the time, the study was seen as a valuable contribution to science, a unique data set that could never be replicated. It was a period where the ethics of human experimentation were loosely defined, and the perceived greater good of scientific knowledge often outweighed the rights of the individual. Some historians believe that this public transparency was actually the study's best defense. Because it was published in the light of day, it was assumed that it must be ethical. It is a haunting paradox. The more the researchers shared their findings, the more the reality of the situation seemed to disappear behind a veil of professional jargon. However, the cost of this knowledge was being paid by families who had no idea they were part of a decades-long experiment. Because the men were never treated, the disease did not stay confined to them. Records suggest that at least 40 of the men's wives were infected, and in a tragic ripple effect, 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. The study, which had begun with 600 men, was now silently impacting an entire generation of the Macon County community. But as the 1960s arrived, the cultural landscape of America began to fracture. The civil rights movement was challenging the very foundations of racial hierarchy in the South. In 1965, the same year that the Voting Rights Act was passed, a young social worker and epidemiologist named Peter Buxton joined the Public Health Service in San Francisco. Buxton's job was to interview people with sexually transmitted diseases, but during his training, he heard rumors of a long-term study in Alabama that seemed to contradict everything he was learning about modern medicine. He began to dig through the archives looking for answers. What he found next changed his life and eventually the course of American history. As Buxton read through the reports, he was struck by the clinical coldness of the language. He saw the lists of men who had died, the detailed accounts of their autopsies, and the persistent refusal to offer penicillin even after it had become the standard of care. To Buxton, this wasn't a medical study. It was a violation of the most basic human rights. In 1966, he took a risk. He wrote a formal protest to the director of the Division of Venereal Diseases. He argued that the study was morally indefensible and that the men should be treated immediately. The response he received was dismissive. He was told that the study was not yet complete and that the volunteers were happy to participate because of the free meals and burial insurance. But Buxton refused to let the matter drop. For the next 2 years, he continued to push from within the system, writing letters and seeking allies. In 1968, his persistence finally forced the Public Health Service to convene a Blue Ribbon Committee to review the study. This was a critical turning point. For the first time, the program was being scrutinized by an outside panel of experts. Buxton expected the committee to see what he saw, a clear-cut case of medical malpractice. But the committee's decision would be even more shocking than the study itself. The panel consisted of several prominent doctors, many of whom had ties to the Public Health Service. After reviewing the data, they didn't just decide to continue the study, they voted to expand it. They argued that the natural history of the disease was still not fully understood and that the death of the remaining participants would provide the final, necessary pieces of the puzzle. Out of the entire committee, only one member, a physician named Dr. Gene Stolerman, expressed serious reservations. But his voice was drowned out by the consensus of his peers. The study was allowed to continue, and Peter Buxton was told, in no uncertain terms, to keep his mouth shut. For the next few years, Buxton tried to move on with his life, but the memory of the files he had read haunted him. He knew that every day the study continued, more men were dying from a disease that could be cured with a simple injection. He realized that the bureaucracy was designed to protect itself, not the people it served. There was only one way to stop it. He had to go outside the system. In 1972, Buxton shared the story with an old friend who was a reporter. That friend passed the tip to Jean Heller, an investigative journalist for the Associated Press. Heller was known for her tenacity and her ability to navigate complex government records. When she received the tip about a 40-year-old experiment on black men in Alabama, she almost couldn't believe it was true. Heller began a month-long investigation, cross-referencing Buxton's documents with the published medical papers she found in libraries. She interviewed officials at the Public Health Service who, perhaps sensing the coming storm, were surprisingly candid about the program's existence. They didn't seem to realize that the world had changed, and that what they viewed as a scientific achievement would soon be seen by the public as a national disgrace. On the 25th of July 1972, the story broke on the front page of the New York Times. The headline was blunt: "Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years." The public reaction was immediate and explosive. The imagery of government doctors withholding medicine from poor rural citizens touched a nerve in an America already cynical from the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. The halls of Congress began to echo with demands for an explanation. But as the investigation began to unfold, it became clear that the rot went deeper than just one study in Alabama. The records suggest that the mindset that allowed the program to exist was widespread within the medical establishment of the era. What the investigators found next, however, was a layer of deception that even Peter Buxton hadn't fully uncovered. As the media spotlight intensified, the survivors of the study were finally being identified and interviewed. For many of these men, now in their 70s and 80s, the news that they had been part of an experiment was a revelation. They had spent decades believing they were the beneficiaries of the government's kindness. To learn that they had been used as material was a psychological blow that, for some, was worse than the disease itself. The government's first instinct was damage control. They appointed another committee to investigate the program, but this time the public was watching. The hearings revealed a pattern of negligence and a lack of informed consent that was impossible to justify. But even as the program was officially shut down in late 1972, a new set of questions began to emerge. What was to be done for the survivors? How many had died because of the study? And most importantly, how could such a thing have happened for 4 decades without anyone stopping it? The archives began to reveal that the burial insurance, which had lured the men into the study, was more than just an incentive. It was a contract. To receive the money for their funeral, the families had to agree to allow the government to perform an autopsy. The researchers weren't just waiting for the men to die, they had a financial stake in their deaths. And that's when the narrative took another, even more disturbing turn. As the dust from the initial media firestorm began to settle, the focus shifted from the headlines to the courtrooms. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the survivors and their families. The lead attorney was a man named Fred Gray, a legendary figure who had previously represented Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. Gray understood that this wasn't just a case of medical malpractice. It was a fundamental breach of the social contract between a government and its most vulnerable citizens. The legal proceedings forced the government to open its archives even wider. What emerged was a paper trail that painted a picture of a scientific community that had become profoundly disconnected from its own humanity. Internal letters revealed that the researchers viewed the men not as patients, but as subjects or clinical material. There were debates in the correspondence about whether the men were intelligent enough to understand their condition, a justification used to maintain the silence. Yet, as Fred Gray pushed for a massive settlement, the government's defense remained rooted in the standards of the past. There is no clear consensus on whether the doctors involved believed they were doing something wrong at the time. Some historians believe they were products of a medical culture that prioritized the pursuit of knowledge above all else, while others suggest that the racial dynamics of the 1930s South made it easy for them to overlook the suffering of black men. In 1974, the government reached a $10 million out-of-court settlement. It was a significant sum for the time, but when divided among the survivors and the families of the deceased, it felt to many like a hollow gesture. For the families of the men who had died in agony, no amount of money could replace the decades of lost life or the betrayal of trust. But the legacy of the program wasn't just measured in dollars. It triggered a massive overhaul of how the United States regulates human experimentation. The outcry led directly to the National Research Act and the creation of the Belmont Report, which established the ethical principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. The Institutional Review Boards, or IRBs, that govern every medical study today are the direct descendants of the tragedy in Macon County. And that's when the narrative began to move from the legal to the deeply personal. For decades, the survivors carried the weight of the study in silence. But in 1997, 65 years after the first Ford Model A's arrived in Alabama, the surviving men were invited to the White House. Only 5 were healthy enough to attend. In the East Room, before a crowd of dignitaries and cameras, President Bill Clinton delivered a formal apology. The United States government did something that was wrong, he stated, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and our guideposts for investigation. One of the survivors, Herman Shaw, stood at the podium. He was 94 years old, a man who had lived through the entire duration of the study. He spoke with a quiet dignity that silenced the room. He didn't ask for pity. He asked for remembrance. He wanted the world to know that the men of Macon County were not just statistics or material. They were hard-working men who loved their families and believed in the promises of their country. But even after the apology, the shadow of the program refused to dissipate. In the years that followed, sociologists began to notice a disturbing trend. In many minority communities, there was a profound and persistent distrust of the medical establishment. When public health officials tried to launch vaccination campaigns or clinical trials, they were met with skepticism and fear. The memory of the 600 men had become a cultural touchstone, a warning passed down through generations. Some researchers suggest that the Tuskegee effect has had a measurable impact on public health, contributing to lower life expectancies and higher rates of untreated chronic illness in communities of color. The study didn't just hurt the 600 men, it created a lasting psychological barrier that medical science is still struggling to dismantle today. However, as we look back from the perspective of the 21st century, some details remain shrouded in mystery. There is no clear consensus on why the study wasn't stopped earlier by the many doctors who knew about it. Records suggest that hundreds of medical professionals were aware of the program over the years, yet only a handful, like Peter Buxton, ever spoke up. Was it a collective moral blindness? Or was it the power of a bureaucracy that had become so large that no one felt responsible for its direction? What happened next in the history of medical ethics was a slow, painful process of reconciliation. The Tuskegee Health Benefit Program was established to provide medical care to the survivors and their families, a small attempt to finally fulfill the promise made in 1932. The last widow of a study participant passed away in 2009, and the last of the children who received benefits are now reaching old age. The physical evidence of the study, the clinic at the Tuskegee Institute, the handwritten logs, the vials of useless medicine is now preserved in museums and archives. They serve as a grim reminder of what can happen when the pursuit of science is decoupled from the pursuit of ethics. But the story doesn't truly end with a settlement or an apology. It lives on in the questions we still ask today. about the power of the state, the rights of the individual, and the transparency of those in power. As the sun sets over the quiet fields of Macon County today, the landscape looks much as it did in 1932. The cotton still grows, and the backroads are still dusty. But the silence of that era has been replaced by a complicated, ongoing conversation. The 600 men who once stepped forward for free health care have left behind a legacy they never intended. They are the reason we have the protections we have today. Yet they paid for those protections with their lives and their trust. Some historians believe we have learned the lesson of Macon County, while others warn that the same impulses, the desire for data at any cost, the dehumanization of the vulnerable, are always lurking beneath the surface of progress. The records remain open, the stories are still being told, and the true meaning of what happened during those 40 years continues to evolve. In the end, the program that observed 600 men serves as a mirror, reflecting not just the failures of the past, but the constant necessary vigilance required for the future. What we choose to see in that mirror remains the most important question of all.